Hello everyone, my name is Mitch Handley from Inventory Hive, and thanks to everyone today who's registered for today's webinars about pets in properties. What we're going to be talking about today is the renters reform side of things. So we've invited along David from JMW Solicitors today. So thanks to David for taking part in today's webinar. And I'm delighted as well to be joined by Sandy from the Tenant Deposit Scheme as well. So she'll be running across some statistics and some case studies and examples about pets in properties as well. And then I'll be concluding today's webinar about property inventories as well, about how you can utilise those if you're decided to manage your property with pets inside them as well. So thanks to everyone who's registered today. If you do have any questions, just pop them in the questions box on the right hand side. So there should be a little section where you can pop in some questions, which I'll be looking at today and managing those. So if those do come through, I'll try and answer those. We'll try and run through those at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to David, who will be talking about pets in properties and the renters reform side of things. So thank you, David, and fire away.
Wow, okay, thank you. So I suppose the Renters Reform Bill, obviously most people will be aware, sort of rejigs the whole pet sort of landscape, although I have to say not as much as people think, and certainly not as much as was entirely promised by the government in the white paper. So can we punch on to my first slide, please, Mitch?
Yep.
So the position is that under the new Renters Reform Bill, there'll be a general right for any tenant to ask to keep a pet, and the landlord can't unreasonably refuse that. But, and this is really critical, this is now an implied term in a tenancy agreement in the same way that Section 11 of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985 implies repairing obligations. So it doesn't matter if you write it in your tenancy agreement or not, it's implied into your tenancy agreement. But what's weird about all of this is it's not a marketing rule. So unlike the changes that have been recently made to the Renters Reform Bill to say no DSS marketing is illegal and you can't market a property as no DSS or no pets, there's nothing to stop you marketing a property as no pets, or even refusing somebody on the basis that they have a pet. But once they're into your property, if they then whip a pet out from behind their back, I suddenly realised I was going to get this completely wrong and say whip a pet out from their back passage, and that just sounded wrong in every possible way. So if they whip a pet out from behind the back, then they have an implied right to have a pet, and you can't then unreasonably refuse it. So the deal is not quite what was advertised by the government in the sense that pet discrimination is still permissible, but also it's kind of worse than that because it actually sort of encourages tenants really to lie about the pet until they're in your property, and then say, oh, by the way, I've got 5 dogs, and I've got an implied right, and you can't unreasonably refuse it. So that's not an ideal scenario. And then the other problem is, well, and the question that everyone will immediately be wanting to ask me is, well, what do you mean by unreasonably refuse? And this is a bit unclear. So that, to some extent, is the substance of what I'm going to talk about in a bit. So if we could move on a little bit now. So there's a time limit. So once you are asked for consent, and the tenant must ask, and technically the tenant doesn't have the right until they ask, then the landlord or via their agent has 42 days to either give that consent or refuse that consent. And it's a strict 42-day time limit. Although in practice, if you breach the 42-day time limit, there's no penalty for doing so, but the implication is that the tenant can then go to court and ask the court to say that you're being unreasonable by having not responded within 42 days. It is open to the landlord to ask for more information within that 42-day time limit. And, you know, obvious things that you might ask for are like, well, what pet and what is it? And technically you get 7 further days after that further information is given to make your decision. And then if you're subject to a superior lease, so you've got a flat, for example, in a block of flats that has a no pets clause in the superior lease, then you can seek, you're obliged as a landlord to seek permission from your superior landlord. And then you have 7 days after that permission is given to say yes or no to the tenant. So there's a whole set of time limits baked into all of this. If we could jump on again. Right, the law also says that you're entitled to ask the tenant for an indemnity or to have pet insurance or to obtain pet insurance, and you can make them pay for it. So the Tenant Fees Act is modified to allow basically for pet indemnities and pet insurance as permitted payments. But if you sign up a deal with a tenant and say you have to pay pet insurance, and then they don't pay it, the Renters Reform Bill does nothing to fix that. So there's nothing you can do about it except try and take it out of their deposit later. You can't evict them for not having got it or something like that. So the reality is, I think you probably need to consider an appropriate set of clauses in tenants agreements. Tenants agreements are almost going to be amended to essentially reflect the wording of the Act, which is, if you ask for a pet, you can't unreasonably refuse, but then having a whole series of things, say if consent is granted, it will be on these bases, and you will have to have insurance and so on and so forth. So then you can then say, if you can then basically say, well, the tenant hasn't paid the pet insurance, and so I should be entitled to evict them using a discretionary ground possession for breach of contract, which obviously will be discretionary, but if the government's put in a system and a process, then you've got a reasonable basis on which you might ask for that discretion to be exercised in your favour. Right, next bit. So, as I already said, the key question is, what's reasonable? Because there's very little about this. Within the Act itself, the only thing that is definitively reasonable as a cause to refuse a pet is if your superior landlord says no. So, in a sense, landlords who have flats are in a better position on this because almost all superior leases have no pets clauses in them. The vast majority of superior landlords say no. If your superior landlord says no, that is the end of the discussion. You're entitled to say no, and that's as far as this goes. There's nothing more that can be said. It's always reasonable to say no if a superior landlord says no. There's obviously ways to manipulate that clearly by, for example, holding this. If you own both, to hold the superior title in a company name and take a lease in your personal name, so you can manipulate that structure as well. But that will become increasingly difficult with the freehold reforms the government is putting in place. Other than that, it's difficult to say what's reasonable and what isn't. There is very little case law, and all the case law that exists, it really relates to commercial properties, and it's mostly about situations where someone wants to change the use of their property or to assign it to somebody else. So in commercial leases, it's common for you to have a clause in that says, well, this property is for use as a news agent, and then they say, well, actually, we'd like to change it to a kebab shop, and you say, well, no, that's not reasonable, and you get to go to court and have a great long discussion about that. There are lots and lots of cases about that. And then the other scenario that comes up a lot in commercial leases, because they tend to be quite long for 10+ years, is somebody says, well, I want to close my business down and assign my lease to somebody else, and the landlord says no, and they say, well, that's not reasonable. So there are a series of cases, but obviously those scenarios in commercial leases are not terribly helpful in general terms in thinking about whether or not you should have a dog in a property. So there's some difficulty about applying those cases from one scenario to another. But I've actually done some thinking about this, and actually, ironically, wrote an article for a law journal about this a while ago. So I've been thinking about this for a while. And there are some useful principles we can draw. The first is that the onus is almost certainly on the tenant to show that the landlord's behaviour is unreasonable. So the landlord's refusal is normally assumed to be reasonable up until the point the tenant takes it to court and says it's unreasonable. Now, there is a caveat to that, which is that if you are evicting a tenant for having a pet and having refused permission, it is probably a defence for a tenant to say, I asked for permission and it was unreasonably refused. So it can be used in two different ways, but it's up to the tenant to say that the landlord was unreasonable and demonstrate why they were unreasonable. But if a landlord gives a set of reasons for saying no, and it's like if you give no reason, you just say no, that is likely to be viewed by the court as unreasonable. So it's not a simple, oh, it's up to the tenant to prove it in all cases. If the tenant says that the landlord's being unreasonable and gives a sort of set of reasons that are reasonable or a case that shows unreasonableness, it's then up to the landlord to push back. It's what we call a double burden of proof. So the burden of proof switches. It's up to the tenant to show that your landlord's been unreasonable, but having made that case, it's the landlord to push back against it. So if a landlord turns around and just says no pets and doesn't give any reasons at all, that is a bit of a risky strategy because it's likely to be viewed as unreasonable behaviour. But if you give reasons, then you are bound by those reasons and you can't go and change them easily later in court. But if you give a whole slew of reasons, some of which are good and some of which are bad, that doesn't stop you basically putting all your weight on good reasons later in court. So it's generally a good idea to give reasons, but to give every possible reason you can think of, and keep them quite wide in specification, because you can then harden your position later. Now, the other thing that's particularly useful, and this is where I think it's particularly relevant, is that it is open to a landlord to have an estate policy in relation to the management of their property. And this is partly, when I say estate policy, obviously it's partly about larger estates of multiple buildings, but there's no reason why an estate policy couldn't simply apply to one flat or one house. And interestingly, an estate policy can be created after you've been asked for permission, so you can make one up after the fact. And you could have an estate policy that banned unsuitable pets, because one of the things that's really annoying about this legislation is, of course, it doesn't define pet. And the first thing I always thought of was whether I could ask a landlord for a pet llama, because obviously most of the government's thinking in terms of cats and dogs and hamsters and stuff like that. But being a bit of a strange individual like I am, the first thing I thought was, can I write to a landlord and get a micro pig or a pet llama and say that's my pet, and move them into my property? And let's be honest, there are people with those. Some people have unusual ideas about what pets are, let's put it that way, and they turn up in the press now and again, and they're always quite entertaining. So one, it could preclude unsuitable pets, and obviously more prosaically, let's put the llamas to one side. But if you have someone wants to have a Great Dane in your one-bed studio flat, that is probably an unsuitable pet, given the size of the property. And then also an estate policy could preclude pets in inappropriate properties. And the classic example of this that people keep coming back to is HMOs, or any situation where common areas of the property are shared. It's probably unfair to other tenants for one tenant to have a dog, for example, that then wants to be fed in the kitchen and is going to get occasionally washed in the bathroom if they don't want a dog in their property. So an estate policy could manage both of those scenarios. So I think, again, a likely scenario off the back of all this is that landlords are likely to want to create estate policies, and then use them as a basis to say no. So those are the things I've prepared. And there's my contact details, as if by magic. But I will hand over to Sandy for her to say her thing and talk about exciting case studies.
Thank you, David. Let me just head over to Sandy's PowerPoint. If everyone can see that. We've already had a question come in, David, but we'll handle those at the end. So thanks to everyone who's raised questions so far. And thanks for that. And over to you, Sandy.
Thank you. Thanks, Mitch, and thanks for having me. So today I'm just going to talk about pets in properties and tenancy disputes. Before I do that, if you can move on, Mitch, that'd be great. Just for those of you that are unfamiliar with TDS, what does TDS do? We're a multinational government-approved tenancy deposit protection scheme. Not for profit. We offer two schemes, which is the TDS insured, where a low fee is paid and the deposit is held by the agent or independent landlord during the tenancy, and TDS custodial, which is free to use, where the deposit is paid over to us, the scheme provider. The legislation says that not only must we enable the landlord's agents to comply with the legislation, but we must provide free and impartial alternative dispute resolution. We've got lots and lots of free resources, guides, tools, and webinars like this, and to help letting agents, landlords, and tenants alike. So next slide, please. Thanks to Mitch. So how many disputes do we actually deal with? So we deal across England and Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, and last year it was approximately 15,000 adjudications across all of those TDS operated schemes. We also provide alternative dispute resolution for zero deposit. Thank you, Mitch. So what are the disputes about? So unsurprisingly, 2022-2023, and this is just insured stats, TDS insured stats, 50% amount to cleaning, 44% damage, and then followed closely by redecoration, and then gardening and rent arrears of the latter. They don't add up to 100%, as not all claims are single heads of claim. We invariably see claims being made by a landlord against a tenant's deposit across all of those, some or all of those heads of claim. Who raises the disputes? So this is a 5-year trend. 76% of disputes are raised by tenants, with a balance raised by by agents and landlord. That's 24%, and again, that is in our England and Wales insured scheme, but that is a trend across all of the other schemes that we're seeing also. So moving on. So once a landlord has established that a tenant has breached a term of the tenancy agreement, and that they have shown that there has been a loss suffered and they've been able to evidence that, the adjudicator's remedies in respect of each of those heads of claim is either making good, which is generally cleaning or repair, replacement or compensation. The first go-to is always making good, as replacement of an item is only ever justified and should only ever be claimed if the item is so severely and extensively damaged that it is beyond economic repair or its condition makes it unusable. So if you are claiming, then always look to make good first, which is cleaning carpets that have perhaps had got stains on it, or repairing sort of a chipped worktop. And lastly, compensation is where an item's value is reduced or its lifespan is shortened, and an award is made in that respect to compensate for the loss in aesthetic value. So pets in properties.
Oh, sorry about that.
So, that's okay.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
We've got there. As David alluded to, there is sort of a slight tweak to the Tenant Fees Act in that indemnity and insurance can be charged to a tenant. However, the Tenant Fees Act itself capped deposits, so therefore pet deposits in England and Wales are no longer allowable, unless of course you have taken less than the 5 weeks cap for deposit, at 6 weeks if the annual rental is over £50,000 per annum. So given the large number of disputes that I've referred to, sort of 15,000 per annum, and that a large proportion of those relate to cleaning and damage, surprisingly, we do not usually see many claims for pet-related damage. And this is because currently the pet owners get the consent of their landlord to keep a pet, and we find they are responsible and careful with their pets to ensure that there is no damage, or if there is, they put the damage right prior to the end of the tenancy. So I did do a little bit of research with my team, and over a 3-month period we recorded every single damage head of claim and cleaning head of claim that included damage and cleaning required as a result of PET, and the percentage was very low, which was quite surprising. So in properties, what can go wrong? Well, obviously, during the pandemic and following the pandemic, there has been an increase in pet ownership, with lots more tenants keeping pets. And in some cases, not all, as I mentioned, some are responsible pet owners and actually repair the damage. A pet may cause damage, and the potential issues that we see can include chewing of skirting boards, scratching of doors and furniture, stained carpets, damage to lawns and gardens, pet odours that remain in a property at the end of the tenancy, pet hair on furniture and carpets, and also claims for flea infestation. So all of these are claims about which a landlord may wish to claim from the tenant's deposit at the end of the tenancy. So in order for them to do that, and how to avoid pet related problems and try and resolve disputes at the end of the tenancy yourself without the need for adjudication, it's really key that a thorough and detailed check-in and check-out report are provided. We find that a detailed check-in report at the start of the tenancy that has been approved by the tenant results less likely to result in dispute, and the parties are likely to reach agreement. So the key things to make sure that you include when considering pets is record the condition of each room in the property, note the small details such as the paintwork, the flooring, the carpets, the doors, curtains, skirting boards, as these are common areas, problem areas where pets may cause damage. Include dated photographs to support the written notes. So photographs support the written word of the check-in and check-out reports, and they need to be sufficiently dated to enable the adjudicator to be sure on the date on which they were taken. Also, make sure that you record any smells in the property. So if the check-in report says smells fresh and clean, then you'll need to make sure that the checkout report says if that is not the case. So you might wish to say, it smells of dog, smells of pets, or an odour, the same way that you would if there was an odour of smoking or an odour of cooking. Don't forget the outside space too, so ensure that you've got all areas of the property, to include the outside space, covered within the check-in and check-out report. So do say what the condition of the lawn is, because often that can be ruined potentially with a pet. And are there any holes in the garden or fences, things like that? So make sure you cover every area. And then also, as I've alluded to, note whether or not the property has had a professional clean at the start of the tenancy. So these are all key things that you need to be looking out for when a pet has potentially been at the property. Thanks, Mitch. So we're going to just look at 2 or 3 case studies very quickly. In this case, the landlord was claiming for cleaning. The landlord had given permission for the tenant to keep a dog and a cat, provided the property was returned free from odours and pet hair. Obviously, the Tenant Fees Act precludes charging a tenant as a matter of course to pay a third-party professional cleaner. In this instance, the tenant had provided evidence that they had paid for a cleaner themselves, but acknowledged that an odour remained. On the basis that the check-in report said that the property was freshly clean and there was a clear odour at the end of the tenancy, noted in both the check-out report and acknowledged by the tenant, in this case by way of an admission, the adjudicator made a further award for carpet cleaning because to remove the residual odour, because the property was not returned in the same condition and standard of cleanliness as it was at the start of the tenancy. So a good check-in and check-out report there, as I've alluded to before, is key. And obviously you do need to take into account the Tenant Fees Act. Thanks, Mitch. So this one is in relation to damage. So the landlord was claiming for scratches to wooden flooring caused by a tenant's dog. Now, obviously, scratches could be caused by the dragging of chairs, the moving of furniture. So, it's not always going to be a dog, and you would need the evidence from the start and the end of the tenancy. So he wanted to sand and rebuff and treat the flooring, and supported the claim with an invoice. The check-in report said that the floor was faded and marked in places, and the checkout report recorded that there was a small area of multiple scratches at the end of the tenancy. So the adjudicator was satisfied that there was an obligation in the tenancy agreement for the tenant to return the property to the same standard. The check-in report evidenced the start condition of the flooring and the checkout the end condition of the flooring, and there was a clear deterioration. However, the full amount claimed was not awarded in this particular case. For the adjudicator to have done that, that would have placed the landlord in a better position at the start of the tenancy. And the adjudicator had to consider the pre-tenancy condition of the flooring, which from the check-in report noted that it was already faded and marked and scratched in places already. So the adjudicator made a contribution towards the sanding and rebuffing of the floor in respect of the area where the additional damage was caused only. So again, key here that you have the record of the start and at the end of the tenancy to show that deterioration and the extent of that deterioration. And then the last case study, again, is damage. The tenant had permission to keep one cat. The tenancy agreement provided for the tenant to accept responsibility for the damage it caused. The tenant actually brought in some more cats and birds actually within the property without permission. Obviously, this is current legislation. The checkout report recorded damage to the whole wall, which was consistent with clawing by a cat, and that was not recorded as being present at check-in. So the adjudicator was able to make an award of making good that area caused by the cat. So I think it's key here that without the good before and end evidence, decisions or awards are likely to be compromised. But as I say, most pet owners are responsible. If they do cause damage, they put that right, and if not, provided you have the good evidence, then you would be able to claim from the deposit. So that's me. Thanks ever so much, Mitch.
No problem. Thank you very much, Sandy. Really insightful presentation there. And what I'll be in my presentation that I'll be doing now, I'll be pretty much reiterating some of the points Sandy made, but also providing just a couple of more hints and tips as well. So thanks to Sandy from the TDS. So before I get started, I'm Mitch from Inventory Hive. I'm the marketing manager here. So we provide property inspection software for letting agents, independent inventory clerks, student accommodation, build to rent, etc., to create all of their check-ins, check-outs, interim inspections, etc., for all the properties they manage. And obviously, without the help of the TDS, because we work closely with Sandy at the TDS to understand statistics and insight of some of the disputes raised to help our users create those detailed reports. So before getting into the property inspection side of things, I'm just going to run through an overview of the problem, and probably this image I've put on screen here probably typifies things. You want to look after a pet, you've got a pet you want to look after who's really cute, but obviously causes a lot of mess, as you can see from the image here. In many countries, there's been a general increase in pet ownership over the years. More people consider pets as an integral part of their families. According to surveys and studies, there's a significant percentage of households own pets, and this includes homeowners and renters. The demand for pet-friendly houses has been on the ride, especially since the puppy boom from the COVID pandemic. Obviously, every time you looked on social media, it seemed like, and one of my family or friends was getting a new pet in the house. And because of that, the demand for pet-friendly housing was on the rise. Landlords and property managers have become more open to allowing tenants to have pets, recognising the potential benefits of attracting a larger pool of renters, which I'll come on to on the next slide. You can implement landlord policies regarding pets, which can vary from some landlords allowing pets with certain restrictions and additional fees, while others may have a strict no pet policy. Some landlords have started to implement more flexible pet policies to appeal to a broader range of tenants. And in some rental agreements, landlords may require tenants with pets to pay a pet deposit or additional pet fees, and this is intended to cover any potential damage caused by pets. Tenants have also been known to sneak pets into the property. I remember when my partner was a dog walker and she used to bring dogs home for an hour or so, and I used to say, why are you bringing this dog home to our house for an hour? And she used to say, the person she's walking the dog form's got the letting agent going around to do an inspection and there's no pets in the property. I was like, yeah, okay, we'll see about that. So yeah, so it's quite often that tenants have been known to sneak pets into the property. I've got some statistics for you as well from letswithpets.org. So 78% of pet owners experience difficulties in finding a rented property that allowed pets. 72% of letting agencies thought landlords would not allow pets in their properties. 47% of landlords gave tenants no reason why pets were banned. 14% of pet owners kept their pets without their landlord's consent. And one stat which I thought was quite amusing is 10% of landlords even banned goldfish. So yes, that's an interesting one. There are plenty of benefits for allowing pets in a rented property. So I know initially you might think as a landlord or letting agent, right, a strict no pet policy, but there are lots of benefits for allowing pets. And first of all, you've got the expanded tenant pool. So allowing pets can broaden the pool of potential tenants. Many people that are pet owners are welcome them. Helps increase the landlord's chances of finding suitable renters quickly. You also get high tenant satisfaction. So tenants with pets are likely to be more satisfied if they can live with pets. The satisfaction comes with a more likely to have a longer tenancy agreement or longer lease agreement, and it increases tenant retention as well. Also, having a pet, allowing pets reduces the chance of void periods as well. So pet-friendly properties tend to rent more quickly, reducing the time a property sits vacant. And also, this is particularly beneficial for landlords seeking to maximise rental income and minimise losses due to empty houses as well. So that is something to take into consideration as well. You've also got the emotional and health benefits as well. So pets can provide emotional support and companionship for tenants, obviously contributing to the COVID tenant puppy boom, as I call it as well. And studies have shown that having pets can reduce stress and improve the overall well-being of tenants as well. But also it can help increase rental income as well. And with a larger pool of potential tenants, landlords may have the opportunity to set higher rental prices, especially if the property offers pet-friendly features and amenities as well. So what could you do pre-tenancy? So include a pet policy in the tenancy agreement. So clearly outline the terms and conditions related to pets in the agreement, specify rules regarding the type, size, and number of pets allowed in the property, as well as any additional fees if needed. You can also make sure the tenancy agreement is up to date with this as well. You can also screen tenants and their pets if applicable. So request information about the tenant's pets during the application process. So this may include details about the type, the breed, the size, and behaviour of the pets. And landlords can use this information to assess whether pets are suitable for that property. If possible, arrange to meet the tenant's pets if you want to before finalising the tenancy agreement as well. You can also get a pet reference as well. So I've heard about these as well. So ask for references from previous landlords or neighbours who can vouch for the tenant's responsible pet ownership, and they can provide valuable information about the pet's behaviour and any potential issues as well. You can also implement a pet deposit and fees. So consider requiring a pet deposit or additional pet fees to cover any potential damages, and clearly outline the amount and conditions for the return of the deposit in the tenancy agreement. And obviously Sandy's covered quite a bit of that already. Also, you can review insurance coverage as well, I know I've had a question coming about this already. So check your landlord insurance policy to ensure that it provides adequate coverage for potential damages caused by pets. So some landlords may require tenants to obtain renters insurance with pets liability coverage as well. Also, it's good to educate your tenants on pet etiquette as well. So provide tenants with information on responsible pet ownership during the tenancy to make sure it also protects your asset alongside that. But the key thing is, and it's probably our expertise as well from Inventory Hive, is to make sure you inspect the property and conduct a thorough inspection report of the property before the tenant moves in. Document the condition of the property and take clear photos as well. And this will serve as a baseline for assessing any damages that may occur during the tenancy if you do have a pet. By taking these steps, the landlord can create a transparent and positive relationship with the tenants who do have pets, minimising any potential conflicts, ensuring the well-being of both the property and the tenant. So the first thing, obviously, if you do allow tenants in your property, is the check-in inventory report. So state on the report that pets have been permitted, and this is quite a crucial one, and also state as well what type of pet. So if you've allowed a pet and it's a goldfish, then obviously state that on the check-in inventory report in the report notes section. And the reason I say it's important to state what type of pet is allowed is then you can take that into consideration when doing your checkout report, what type of pet has been allowed and what type of common damages and damages that may occur when relating to that pet. For example, if it is just a goldfish, then you're not expected to have fair wear and tear or scratches on the door like Sandy mentioned earlier because you haven't got a dog, for example. Also, it's important to be more granular with your descriptions. For example, outline the odours, as Sandy's mentioned earlier. Obviously, what's happened in the garden, for example, you've got constant fouling, which you need to take into consideration as well. And also, like I said, the scratches on the door or the skirting board as well. Evidence common dispute areas with more photos, like your doors and gardens, etc. And also outline if carpets or any other areas have been professionally cleaned recently as well. And it's important to keep receipts and invoices as well, because if it does go to a dispute later on down the line, then you've got the evidence of that, not only on your check-in inventory report, but also you've got the receipts and invoices to back that up. And with Inventory Hive as well, you can attach those invoices and receipts alongside your check-in inventory reports as well. But the key thing is, and something we're really proud and really advocate here in Inventory Hive, is to make sure you get tenant feedback on your check-in reports as well. So if you just do a check-in inventory report and don't allow for any tenant feedback or don't allow your tenant to sign it off, then if it does go to a dispute or if it is submitted as evidence, then not having that tenant feedback at check-in increases the risk of a dispute happening. So if you allow your tenant to check in if you allow your tenant to provide feedback on the check-in report, the reason it reduces the amount of disputes happening is because they've got the opportunity to add further evidence, add any further issues to the check-in report that might have been missed. They're not actually criticising your check-in report, they're actually adding more evidence, reducing the chance of a dispute. A good example being is, it might not be relevant to pets, but you might have done an inspection report, but then if the tenant goes to use the shower a couple of days after they moved in and the hot water doesn't work, then they can evidence that on the check-in and note it down. So they're not criticising the report, they're actually adding more evidence in. Relating to pets, it could be a case of like if there is a scratch on the door that wasn't noted on the check-in report, then a dog might contribute to that, but obviously if you're outlining that or allowing your tenant to feedback that back in on the check-in, then that is really beneficial as well. You've then got your interim inspections as well, which personally are probably one of the most important inspections to do. So when you do your interim inspections, you need to outline if there's any evidence of pets, if it hasn't been agreed by the landlord or in the tenancy agreement. So I know I mentioned about the story about we sometimes looked after a pet when their landlord or letting agent was going around to doing a midterm inspection because pets weren't allowed. So look out for evidence of pets, like any dog bowls or water bowls lying about, any evidence of fouling in the garden or any dog toys had lingering about. So keep an eye out of those when you're doing the interim inspections to see if there's evidence of pets in the property when they've not been allowed. If there are pets allowed in the property, is it the correct type of pet or the correct number of pet? For example, if you've agreed one pet in the property during the tenancy agreement, then outline that on the interim inspection as well. When you're doing the interim inspections, it's good to outline any maintenance issues and tenancy breaches, and obviously the number of pets which are outlined in the tenancy agreement could be deemed as a breach of that. But also make sure when you're doing the interim inspection is to raise those maintenance issues to make sure they get fixed. Raising those maintenance issues during the middle of the tenancy is a perfect opportunity to get those rectified and fixed before the checkout. If those don't get rectified or fixed during the tenancy before the checkout, then it could cause confusion at the end of the tenancy. Because say, for example, if the tenant returns the property to a suitable condition at checkout, but they've raised some maintenance issues during the midterm inspection and they don't get fixed, then it can cause delay and a void period at the checkout as well. So if there are any maintenance issues raised during the interim inspection, make sure they get rectified and fixed before the checkout report is done. Another type of report you can do is a pre-checkout report. So if you've not heard of a pre-checkout report before, it's basically, as the name indicates, is an inspection that happens before the final checkout on move-in day. So it's typically carried out around a month prior to the end of the tenancy, and there's a few good reasons why demand for these pre-checkout reports is so high among landlords and agents, especially if a pet is in the property. So one of the main reasons is that they've reduced deposit disputes. So I was looking at some of the latest TDS figures recently, and obviously, as Sandy highlighted earlier on, cleaning, damages and redecoration comes towards the top of those. And many of these issues require a certain amount of time frame to be rectified. And by conducting these inspections before the end of the tenancy, both the tenant and the agent can action these problems in good time before the tenancy move out. So the pre-checkout visit also allows the agent and the landlord to highlight areas of concern or poor cleanliness to the tenant ahead of moving out day. And it may be simply be that the tenant isn't aware of what's expected at checkout or what should be cleaned. For example, say for example, the garden's got lots of fouling in the garden. So obviously, if the tenant is aware of this, they've got the opportunity to rectify this before the checkout date, and they can clean that up before the actual checkout report happens, and then a dispute or deduction happens from the deposit. They also reduce tenancy delays. So much like the first point, the pre-checkout inspection means that everyone has time to rectify any problems before the last day of the tenancy. Not only does it speed up the process for agents and landlords who'll be keen to get new tenants into the new property as soon as possible, but also prevent a loss of rental income as well. It also helps speed up the deposit return for tenants as well, and it's a win-win for everyone concerned as well, and it ends the tenancy on a positive footing as well. And that leads on to my final point about they boost relationships, reviews and reputations for the landlord and the agent. So ending the tenancy disputes often occur, tenancy disputes often occur because expectations weren't clear before the checkout. So making sure you do these pre-checkout reports builds that relationship with the tenant because you're outlining what's expected at checkout before the checkout report actually happens. So if you're communicating that with the tenant before the move out date, then they'll be more beneficial of that. They'll be more happy you've raised that with them so they can get that rectified, and then no deposit disputes or deductions happen at the end of the tenancy. And then the final report is obviously your comparative checkout reports. So the key thing is before doing your checkout report is to put time in to the original check-in report. The checkout report is only half of the evidence and worthless without a good check-in report. If you get to the initial inventory and check-in completed properly, then you'll save time and stress at the end of the tenancy and at checkout. So make sure you put effort into the beginning and the check-in report because it reaps the rewards later on. and I'm sure Sandy will testify this later on, when a dispute does get raised, one of the key documents that you'll need, or key pieces of evidence, is your check-in and your check-in report. Also, make sure you be specific about the condition cleanliness as well. So the job of a check-in and a check-out report is to capture the condition and the cleanliness of the property and the contents of the property at the start and the end of the tenancy. So note each of these points separately and be specific as well. So be less likely to miss key details as well. And don't forget what you can't see as well. And Sandy touched upon this on the previous PowerPoint as well. So you've got issues with damp and mold, which sometimes you can't see, but also you've got pets, waste and cooking are always visible as well, and they can create an odor. So make sure you know any of these suspicious smells and the whereabouts in the property on the checkout as well. Also, another tip as well when you're doing a checkout report is don't waste your time on the wrong details. So property visits and image reports can be time consuming, but these days there's many ways to cut these down. So there's no point inspecting absolutely everything in the checkout report. You only really need to inspect stuff where there's a deposit dispute, any cleaning differences, and any major differences from the original check-in report. So there's no point noting on the checkout report that the carpets are all clean and there's no issues there when it was like that at check-in. On the checkout report, only outline those deductions and anything where there's any major differences. So to conclude, allowing pets in your properties have huge benefits, and one of the best ways to protect your landlord's asset is to create clear and detailed property inspection reports. As Sandy has testified, the check-in and check-out is probably one of the most important pieces of evidence, and if it does go to court, that would be needed as well. So hopefully I've covered off everything today in that PowerPoint about inventory reports. If you want to learn more about Inventory Hive, we offer a free 30-day trial, no card details required. You can create unlimited reports, unlimited users as well. You get cloud-based storage. You can engage with your tenants digitally as well to gain feedback and capture their signatures as well. And recently we've just won some awards as well at the Negotiator Awards as Supplier of the Year to letting agents, technology and apps, and we've also been best medium supplier at the Air Masters as well. We are a property market industry supplier, and yeah, hopefully everyone enjoyed that presentation. So I think I've got a few questions that have come in, so let me just open those. Bear 1 second. Okay. So the first question I've got in, I'll just bear 1 second. Right. I think this one's more for you, David. So how does pet insurance help a landlord? So why is it beneficial for a landlord to get pet insurance?
Well, it depends on the exact policy, but the idea is that landlords will be able to demand that tenants either give them an indemnity, but that's not actual money, that's just an indemnity, or that they will buy insurance, which will be insurance to the landlord's benefit, so the landlord will be able to claim for pet damage. So I mean, the primary reason it benefits you is that if the tenants paid the premiums, you're likely to get paid.
Lovely stuff. Okay, this one is for, if you just bear 1 second, my screen isn't the best at the moment. So, okay, question for David. What are your thoughts on charging a 2-tier high rent for a pet?
I don't know, I don't have any thoughts. It's legal, can do it. It will continue to be legal. The difficulty will be that you won't be able to make your consent conditional on a higher rent. I don't think the courts will stand for that. So the difficulty will be if you're saying I'm going to charge a pet rent, people will move in a pet and then tell you about the pet after the fact, and then insist that it's reasonable for you to let them have the pet on the basis that you were clearly perfectly happy with pets to begin with.
Sandy, had a question come in. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, have you seen a rise in arrears, disputes and claims, especially with regard to pets?
We have seen increase in deposit disputes that we're dealing with due to the growth of our schemes. But as I've said, a 3-month sort of analysis of disputes that have come in have not shown a large proportion of damage claims as a result of pets. So no, we haven't seen it. We haven't seen a huge amount of increase because of pets alone. Rent arrears, you know, it's slightly higher, I think 13% this year, 2022, 2023 than previously years, but we do have TDS resolution, which is available to all parties free of charge mid-tenancy if there are any sort of issues during the tenancy, for example, rent arrears, to help with mediation and rent repayment plans.
Lovely stuff. Question that's coming, it's quite a good one really, because it kind of relates. I'll come on to this after David answered, but can a landlord use allergies as a reasonable excuse to say no to pets by saying they might move into the property at some point?
Well, saying is not quite the same as the reality, and might is not a very good reason, is it? I mean,
Yeah.
It would depend. I mean, one, could this not in fact be resolved by cleaning? It would have to be very serious allergies. But yes, possibly they could use that as a basis, but they would need some evidence that they'd previously resided at the property, and it was likely that they might choose to do so again.
Yeah. I recently went on holiday to Center Parcs, and some of their lodges are pet friendly, and the main differences between them are literally because the fabrics in the sofa, etc., and there's no carpets in these villas, because if they allowed pets in these villas or lodges, then they would have to clean the carpets every time. So these specific pet friendly lodges or villas have laminate flooring, and the sofas are all leather, etc. So that probably relates to the allergies type of thing. Just tagging on to that question, the same person asks, can a landlord just simply say that they're worried about additional damage that pets could do for good reason to say no to pets in the property? I've had bad experiences before, and ideally I don't want to let pets in.
Sorry, it's a reason, but no, I don't think it's a good reason.
Question for...
You know, just to amplify on that, I suppose, I mean, it's not a justified reason in respect of this tenant. If you're going to refuse someone on a reasonable basis, you can't just say that lots of previous tenants have been rubbish, ergo this tenant will be rubbish. That's not a basis, is it?
Got a question for Sandy. It's quite a long one, so just bear with. If carpets were not cleaned at the start of the tenancy, and a tenant mid-tenancy agreed to have the carpets cleaned at the end of their tenancy as part of the agreement to keep a pet. However, sorry, I've lost a question now because another question popped in. However, if the tenant chooses at the end of the tenancy to not clean the carpets, would the TDS agree a deposit deduction given the side agreement, or would they decline the claim? If you want me to read that out again, I can do.
No, that's fine. So a tenant is only obliged to return the property to the same standard as at the start of the tenancy. So in this case, if the carpets were clean, but there was no evidence of them having been professionally cleaned at the start, then strictly speaking, the tenant is not obliged to professionally clean them at the end. And they obviously, from the Tenant Fees Act, they're not able to be, as a matter of course, required to do so. However, if the evidence shows at the end of the tenancy that the carpets were less clean than at the start, then a landlord can claim. And the side agreement, I think, you know, that would very much depend whether that was an agreement that was reached outside of the terms of the tenancy agreement at a later date. And whilst they could, agree to having them cleaned, I'm not. It would very much depend upon the wording of that side agreement, because that might doesn't preclude them from actually cleaning them themselves. But it would depend on whether that was sort of professionally cleaned at cost.
Is there a limit on a pet surcharge? For example, our current pet surcharge is £10 per calendar month. I don't know if that's for you, David, or
Sandy. I mean, you can't have a pet surcharge. You can charge rent, or you could not charge rent, but you can't have a pet surcharge. It's a breach of Tenant Fees Act.
Let's have a look at this one. I have a leasehold flat I rent out. The superior lease states the landlord can't unreasonably withhold permission for pets. What would be unreasonable grounds? What would be classed as unreasonable grounds?
I mean, it's the other way around, really. I mean, that's sort of a bit of an open-ended question. I mean, if the landlord can't unreasonably withhold permission, they've got to grant permission unless there is a good reason to refuse it. In practice, it's probably going to depend on the nature of the pet involved. If you want to get 20 dogs, it's probably reasonable. If you want to get one and it's a reasonably sized dog, then it's probably reasonable. But it's a bit of a protean question, isn't
it? One final question before we conclude today's webinar. Thanks to everyone who's submitted some questions, so we do really appreciate that. I've got a tenant that I've allowed pets into the property for the dog, but the dog barks a lot and annoys his neighbours. Does that mean, how can I remove the tenants if applicable because of this?
Sorry, say that again.
So it looks like they've allowed a tenancy with some dogs in the property, but the dog is barking a lot and is annoying the neighbours. Is there anything that can be done?
You can start a nuisance claim using ground 14 if the neighbours are prepared to give evidence in court.
Lovely stuff. Yeah, that concludes today's webinar today. Thanks to David and Sandy. I really appreciate your time today. I hope everyone enjoyed today's webinar. If you did attend, thank you very much. A recording of this will be emailed out to you in the coming days. And yeah, thanks to David and Sandy. Any final words before we finish up?
No, thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
No problem. No, thank you very much. And thanks to everyone again, and have a superb Christmas. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.